Okay, so get ready because we're going deep on something today that sounds like it's right out of science fiction, but it's really happening right now, and it could be a big deal.
Yeah, it does sound a little unbelievable.
It does. We're talking about pulling carbon dioxide straight out of the air with something called direct air capture, or DA for short. And get this, the biggest DAC facility in the world is already up and running over in Iceland.
That's right. It's called Mammoth, and it's capturing 36,000 tons of CO2 a year, which is like taking almost 9,000 cars off the road every year.
Wow, 9,000 cars. So how does this mammoth factory actually work? I mean, our sources go pretty deep into the process, and I'm really curious to hear more about how they grab that CO2 and what they do with it.
Well, it's kind of like a giant high-tech vacuum cleaner for the air. I guess Mammoth uses these huge fans to pull in the air, and it's got these special filters that trap the CO2 molecules, but they don't just stop there.
That's where the whole turning it into stone thing comes in, right?
You got it. They use a process called mineralization, basically mixing that captured CO2 with water and pumping it deep underground into these layers of the salt rock.
Okay, so I'm picturing the CO2 water flowing into these rocks, and then what? How does it turn into stone?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, chemically speaking. The basalt actually reacts with the CO2 and water, and they form a solid carbonate mineral. So it's like the carbon gets locked up in there and can't get back into the atmosphere.
So it's like a supercharged natural carbon sink, except we're engineering it. I'm curious why Iceland. Do the sources mention why they chose Iceland for this?
Yeah, they do. It's the perfect spot for a couple of reasons. First, they've got tons of geothermal energy there. So there's this clean and reliable power source to run the whole DAC process, which uses a lot of energy.
Makes sense it'd be kind of counterproductive to use fossil fuels to run a carbon capture plant.
Exactly. And second, Iceland has these huge basalt formations, which are perfect for storing all that mineralized CO2. It's like they've got a giant natural vault right under the facility.
It all sounds pretty amazing so far. But every technology has its downsides, right? Our sources also talk about costs and potential problems with DAC. I mean, building and running a facility like Mammoth has got to be pretty expensive, right?
You're right about that. Cost is a big hurdle for DAC right now. It's a lot pricier than other ways to deal with carbon. But one of the sources made this interesting comparison to how solar panels developed.
Oh, yeah, like those big, crunky, expensive solar panels from way back when. Now you see them everywhere and they've gotten way cheaper.
Are they saying that DAC could be like that too?
Yeah, that's the argument. They think as the technology gets better, we produce more of it, and there's more innovation, the cost of DAC could drop like a rock. Climeworks, the company behind Mammoth, is aiming to capture CO2 for just $100 per ton by 2050.
Whoa, that's a huge difference. What makes them think they can pull that off? There are a few things that make them optimistic. For one, there's a lot more focus on climate change globally, and people are more willing to invest in solutions like DAC++. Research and development are happening all the time, and those advancements in capturing CO2 are making it more efficient and cheaper.
Just like any new tech, right? The first versions are always the priciest.
You got it. With more investment and innovation, it's pretty reasonable to think the costs will keep going down. It'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds.
It will. Okay, so how effective is DECI actually at fighting climate change? Our sources kind of go back and forth on this. Some say it's super important and others aren't so sure. What do you make of that?
It's a tricky question, and I think both sides have good points. Some experts see DACI as this vital technology, especially for cleaning up the CO2 we've already put into the atmosphere.
Right, they're saying even if we cut way back on emissions going forward, we still got to clean up the mess we've already made.
Exactly. But some critics are worried that if we rely too much on DZ, we'll forget about the really important stuff like getting off fossil fuels completely. They think it could give us a false sense of security, like we've got this tech that'll clean up our mess so we can keep polluting.
Yeah, like having a magic eraser makes you less worried about making mistakes in the first place.
Exactly. The worry is that it'll slow us down from actually cutting emissions at the source, which is the best solution long term.
Sounds like this debate comes down to the classic technology versus changing how we do things altogether. And we probably need both, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We got to cut back on using fossil fuels big time while also checking out and using technologies like DACI to help fix the damage we've already done. It's a problem with lots of angles and needs lots of different solutions.
Well said. But our sources say DAY isn't just about cleaning up our own planet. It could be used in space, too.
You're talking about exploring other planets, right?
Exactly. This is where things get really mind-blowing. The sources mention using DAY to actually create breathable air on other planets like Mars. Now, that's pretty wild.
It is wild, isn't it? And while it might sound like something out of Star Trek, The science behind it makes sense. The air on Mars is mostly carbon dioxide, so imagine capturing that CO2 and turning it into oxygen, with tech similar to what we're developing for DAC here on Earth.
So we could use DAC to make other planets livable for humans. The possibilities are incredible.
It really shows you how our problems here are connected to things out in space, and how new discoveries can have impacts we never expected both here and on other worlds.
We've covered a lot today. We've talked about how Mammoth captures CO2 and turns it into stone. We've looked at how the costs could go down and the debate about whether DAC is a good solution for climate change. And we even touched on using it to explore space. It's been a fascinating journey so far.
And this is really just the beginning. DAC is still pretty new, and the next few years will be really important in figuring out how it fits into our future.
For sure. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's turn the conversation over to you, the listener.
We've given you a lot to think about. So what are your first impressions? What parts of DC stood out to you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
We'll be back after the short break to keep exploring Ds. Stay tuned.
Yeah, we'll be right back.
So before the break, we were talking about how DC could change how we deal with climate change, but also about some of the possible problems it could cause.
Yeah, it's a powerful tool for sure. But we need to think carefully about how to use it.
Exactly. And thinking carefully. Well, let's get into the more practical stuff about DC, like the economics of it. You said cost is a big issue right now. So how do we make this technology more widespread and get those costs down at the same time?
That's the big question, right? And our sources have some interesting ideas. One article talked about how governments could offer incentives, maybe put a price on carbon to encourage investment in DACs.
Kind of like how they helped solar and wind energy take off with subsidies and tax breaks.
That's the idea. If governments make it more appealing financially for companies to get into DAC, it could boost competition and lead to more innovation, which could then bring the costs down.
It's really interesting how much economic policy can affect how new technology develops.
It really does. Another source looked at private investment in DAC. There are more and more venture capitalists and impact investors who see DAC as a way to make money and help the environment at the same time.
Makes sense. If DAC can become a profitable industry, it'll attract more resources and expertise to help it grow faster.
Right. And with more companies putting money into research and development, we're likely to see even more improvements that make DAC more efficient and less expensive.
So it's like government incentives, private money, and tech advancements all working together to lower costs and make DAC more accessible.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a snowball effect. As the industry grows, the progress gets faster and faster.
But even if we get the cost down, building hundreds of these mammoth facilities all over the world is a massive project. Makes me wonder, where would we even put them all? And what about the impact on the environment from building and running them?
That's a good point. One source stressed how important it is to pick the right spots for daily facilities. They need to be in areas with lots of renewable energy sources to keep their own carbon footprint low.
Of course, we don't want to solve one environmental problem and create a new one, right?
Exactly. Plus, they need access to the right kind of geological formations for storing that CO2. Iceland's basalt formations are perfect. But we've got to find similar places all over the world.
Sounds like a tricky logistical problem.
It is. But it's a problem we got to solve if we're serious about using data to make a real difference.
So changing gears a bit, our sources also get into some of the ethical stuff surrounding DAISY. You mentioned earlier the concern about DAISY making people think we don't need to cut emissions as much.
Yeah, it's super important to remember that DEC is not a cure-all. It's one tool we can use, but it can't replace doing the hard work of switching to a cleaner economy.
But isn't there a risk that focusing on DAC could actually slow us down from reducing emissions? People might think, oh, we have this tech that sucks up CO2, so it's not as big of a deal if we keep using fossil fuels.
That's a valid worry and something we got to watch out for. We need to make it clear that DAC is a helper, not a replacement for cutting emissions at the source.
Like a safety net. It's good to have one, but you wouldn't want to depend on it all the time.
Exactly. Another ethical point the sources bring up is the possibility of unintended consequences. We're talking about tech that could really change the makeup of our atmosphere.
So we got to be careful and make sure we fully understand the risks before we start using DAC on a massive scale.
Absolutely. We need to move forward with a deep understanding of the science and a commitment to doing things responsibly.
Okay, so we've talked about the economics and the ethics of DECI, but what about the social side of things? Who gets to decide how this technology is used? Who wins and who loses?
Those are crucial questions, and our sources did touch on some social justice issues. One article brought up the concern that DD could make inequality worse.
How so?
Well, if DD becomes really valuable, there's a chance that the benefits won't be shared equally. Richer countries and companies might be in a better position to take advantage of it, leaving developing countries behind.
It's important to make sure that everyone benefits from D and it doesn't just become another way to strengthen existing power structures.
Exactly. Another source talked about how important it is to include local communities in decisions about where and how DD facilities are built.
That makes a lot of sense. We need to make sure that the people who are most affected by these decisions have a say and their concerns are taken seriously.
It's about making sure that new technology is used for good and helps to create a fairer, more sustainable world for everyone.
You've given us a really complete picture of both the challenges and the opportunities with D. It's obviously a complex issue with no easy answers. But zooming out a bit, how do you see this technology fitting into the whole climate action picture? Is it a key part of the solution or more of a supporting role?
That's a great question. I think it's actually both. DIA has the potential to help a lot with removing those older emissions and getting us to net zero, especially in industries that are hard to clean up.
But you're saying it's not a magic solution.
Exactly.
Right.
We can't forget that D is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. We still need to cut our emissions, switch to renewable energy sources, protect our natural carbon sinks, and explore all sorts of carbon removal technologies, including DIAC.
So it's about having a bunch of different solutions, each doing its part to tackle the climate crisis.
Precisely. And just like with any investment portfolio, we need to be smart about where we put our resources and energy.
And we need to be aware of the risks and potential downsides of each investment like we've been talking about today.
Absolutely. We need to approach DZ and any other climate solution with a healthy dose of reality and a commitment to sustainability over the long haul.
So it's not about jumping on board with every new technology that comes along. It's about thinking carefully about what it can do well, what the drawbacks are, and making informed decisions about how to use it as part of a bigger plan for dealing with climate change.
Well said. And that brings us to what this deep dive is really all about.
Getting people to think critically and make informed decisions.
Exactly. We've given you a lot of information to digest, but we don't want you to just take our word for it. We want you, our listeners, to really engage with this stuff, form your own opinions, and get involved in the conversation about climate change and new technology.
Because ultimately, it's up to all of us to decide what kind of future we want to create.
Now let's switch gears again and get back to that place where science fiction meets reality. Remember those amazing possibilities we talked about earlier? Using DAZ to explore space, even terraforming Mars.
Oh yeah, those are way too cool to just leave hanging.
Yeah.
Let's jump back into that next.
Okay, so we were just talking about how D could be a big help with climate change here on Earth. But now we're going to go a step further and see how it could be used out in space.
It is pretty mind-blowing to think that a technology meant to fix a problem here could have such a huge impact on space exploration.
Totally. Our sources talk about some really wild ideas like using D to create breathable air on other planets. Let's start with Mars. What exactly are they suggesting?
Well, the air on Mars right now is super thin and mostly carbon dioxide. Not exactly what we need to breathe. But with D, we could potentially transform that CO2 into oxygen.
So instead of just trapping the CO2, we could actually use it to create a livable environment.
Exactly. Picture this deep facilities on Mars pulling CO2 from the air and then using a process called electrolysis to split it into oxygen. Basically, we'd be using electricity to break down the CO2.
That's amazing. We'll basically be terraforming Mars, at least in small areas, using tech that was developed to fight climate change here on Earth. It just goes to show you how connected science is. Sometimes a solution for one problem can lead to unexpected breakthroughs in completely different areas.
I'm curious, what are some of the hurdles to using DC on Mars? I mean, running a facility in that kind of harsh environment can't be easy.
You're right about that. One of the biggest challenges is energy. DC needs a lot of power, and generating that power on Mars is going to take some creative thinking. Solar power might work, but we'd need super efficient panels that can handle all the dust and weaker sunlight on Mars.
What about using Mars's own resources? I remember reading something about the potential for wind power on Mars.
That's another good option. Mars has a lot of dust storms, so harnessing that wind energy could be a way to power DC facilities.
Yeah.
But the turbines would have to be strong enough to survive those extreme conditions.
Sounds like every solution comes with its own set of problems. But that's what exploration is all about, right? Pushing the limits of what's possible usually means overcoming some big obstacles.
I agree. And that brings us to probably the most important question raised by our sources. What are the ethical implications of terraforming another planet?
Yeah, we can't just ignore that. If we can change the environment on Mars, do we have the right to do it?
It's a really tough question, and there's no easy answer. Some people believe we should leave other planets alone and protect them in their natural state.
But others might say, we have a duty to spread life beyond Earth to make sure humans survive if something bad happens to our planet.
And then there's the whole issue of possible life already existing on Mars. What if there are tiny organisms living underground? Do we have the right to potentially mess up their home?
These are serious questions that we need to think about carefully and discuss openly before we start any major terraforming projects.
Definitely. It's a reminder that as we make technological progress, we always have to think about the ethics and make sure we're being responsible stewards of the environment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into DEG, I think we're all left feeling pretty amazed by what this technology could do. From fighting climate change here to maybe one day transforming Mars DEC gives us a glimpse into a future full of possibilities.
But it also highlights the huge responsibility that comes with such power. The decisions we make today about how we develop and use these technologies will have a lasting impact on humanity for generations to come.
We've explored the science, the economics, the ethical questions, and even the crazy possibilities of DEC, but like always, the most important thing about this deep dive is what you, the listener, take away from it.
We've shared a lot of different viewpoints, and now it's your turn to think things over, ask questions, and come to your own conclusions. What role do you think DEG should play in our future? What are your hopes and fears?
We want you to keep exploring these questions, talk about them with others, and be a part of shaping the world you want to see.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.